Welcome to the Hearsay Culture Network and another edition of R&D with D&D, the show that I, Dave Levine, do with my co-host Denise Howell. Denise, good to see you again today.
Great to see you as always, Dave.
We are excited to have on the show someone whose career going back several decades is coming to a close by choice. Brook Baker, professor at Northeastern University Law School, is one of the leading advocates in the access to medicine space going back at least a few decades. Listeners of Hearsay Culture, listeners of This Week in Law going back 20 years have thought about medicine issues ranging from early issues, relatively speaking, involving patents to more recent issues involving COVID and personalized medicine and development of treatments and so forth. And Brooke has been involved over the last 20 to 25 years in all of these issues, but particularly in an issue that is under the radar in a lot of places in the world, particularly places where, like the United States and in Western Europe, where we are fortunate to have access readily, if very expensively, to medicine. And so when we talk about and think about access to medicine, which we're going to be talking about today, what we're thinking about is a very fundamental question, and it's a question that relates to everything from moral and civil rights to issues of intellectual property, which is how do we create a society and a world where every human being, regardless of economic resources or lack thereof, regardless of the governments in which they operate, regardless of even, right, their immutable characteristics, right, like race and gender, have access to the kinds of medicines that we need to maintain happy lives and to maintain long lives. And it won't come as any surprise to people who've paid attention even to the COVID issues in recent years that we live in a highly inequitable world where large portions of the globe not only have access to medicine, but have access to medicine in abundance and even more medicine than they can use, while other parts of the globe have little to no access to that medicine. Being that we are all human beings, this is a moral quandary that Brooke and others have been working on, but we are fortunate to have one of the leading intellectual property law and medicine law experts in the academic world on the show today. Brooke's reputation is well known in the field, but he has worked on a variety of projects over the last 20 to 25 years involving access to medicine, both in Africa and on virtually every continent, I believe, where there are human beings. Most recently, Brooke and I worked together during the COVID pandemic phase on issues involving access to trade secrets and access to other information to scale. So there's your caveat and disclaimer. But we are going to have a wide-ranging discussion today with Brooke involving those issues, as well as technology, what AI might be doing, and what we might do about the next pandemic. So, Brooke, thank you so much for joining us today on R&D with D&D.
Pleasure to be here and to be able to speak with your many listeners.
So I'm going to start us off, Brooke, and get right into it. You spent, as I mentioned, the last 25 years focusing on access to medicine. And we know, as I alluded to in the introduction, that COVID vaccines were not equitably distributed. But what are the most prominent access issues today other than COVID?
Well, there remains, issues of inadequate access and virtually no access to some of the more expensive and what we call biologic medicines. So these are unlike medicines that are small molecules that are relatively easily reverse engineered and produced by many qualified generic producers globally. Biologic medicines are made through, as the name suggests, biologic processes. They're large compounds. They often depend on the particular medium that is living medium that's used to produce them. And they're hard to replicate. Hard to replicate, not just because you don't have access to the patent-based knowledge, but because you don't have access to the cell line. You don't have access to all the trade secrets of very complicated manufacturing processes. And so, monoclonal antibodies, which are a very promising area of therapeutics and even preventative medicines, are virtually unavailable in low and middle income countries. They are very expensive to produce. because we in the global north, in Europe and US, have access to health centers that can do infusions. The developers have really been satisfied to develop products that are administered by infusion, which is, it's not impossible to do everywhere else, but many countries do not have a lot of infusion centers. So even the method of administration of the biologic medicine makes them very hard to use in resource poor settings. Cancer medicine's a perfect example. I mean, there's just a dreadful lack of access to cancer medicines. There's a serious lack of access to opioids, and not so much because they're expensive, though they sometimes are, but because the internationalization of the war on drugs has made the trade in opioids, which are so important for treatment of pain and for palliative care, they really have produced a great deal of hesitancy in developing countries to allow trade in those products. I mean, again, that's a policy choice that was to some extent exported from the global north. Of course, there's still some very expensive small molecule medicines, which are unavailable, and mainly because they're very expensive. But I guess one area which probably doesn't get quite as much attention is that people who live in tropical settings in particular are exposed to many diseases which are called neglected diseases. Chagas, malaria to some extent, even though we all know what malaria is, chingamungas. There are a number of these diseases, over 20, which primarily affect poor people in hot tropical places, for which there are no real good medicines developed. And it's because there's no commercial incentives to big pharmaceutical companies to make medicines that are only for poor people, that poor people can't afford to pay, and which their governments often cannot afford to buy, and for which there are no global funders that provide support. And so we can think of those are medicines that people should have access to, but that they don't. I mean, I think the general principle of access to medicine is that research should be focused on the medicines that everyone needs, not just that are commercially attractive because rich people disproportionately suffer disease. And so that we have lack of access to existing medicines, and we have underdevelopment of medicines that are very important to health and well-being in many countries.
I think of issues involving like the Lou Gehrig's disease ALS, which had the famous now famous ice bucket campaign that brought attention to a disease which is horrific, but also, as well, you haven't pointed out, but is relatively rare compared to the kinds of illnesses we're talking about, which kind of moves us to something that Denise is going to talk about here, involving patents and the incentives around this.
Right, because the pharmaceutical industry is very motivated by the patents that they apply for and receive to pursue the kind of development that you're talking about. But something can happen known as a patent thicket, and some of your advocacy has been in that area. Can you describe what that is for us?
Okay, so patent thickets have two fundamental purposes. So the basic first patent is usually on the active ingredient of a pharmaceutical product. So it's the thing that has the therapeutic or preventative or curative effect, right? And so it's, in a way, it's the most important part of a medicine. And the entities doing the research and development rush to the patent offices, particularly in rich countries, but increasingly in low and middle income countries, so that they can get exclusive rights over that compound. But then, particularly in countries which don't have stringent standards of patentability, the innovator can file multiple successive patents. They can file them on variations in the original chemical entity that may be slightly more effective and that are used in the final product. They can apply for formulations and changes in the formulation, even a simple change from a pill to a capsule. They can apply for the dosage. They can apply for combinations. They can apply for all the manufacturing processes. And so companies have an incentive to file those patents, and increasingly on processes of development and even variations that they're not going to exploit. But the existence of that patent, those patents as a thicket, prevents other inventors, other product developers from using that other target, in essence, to develop alternative to the main patented product. So that's a kind of defensive use of patent thickets, right? It's to crowd out the possibility of competitors entering into the field with a nearly equivalent medical product. But you can also think of patent thickets as being relevant to extending patent term life, because every time a company files a successive patent, and this is more what's called the evergreening function, right? Which is you get 20 years on that new patent. So your original patent term was 20 years, but if you wait until late in that patent term to file a new patent on maybe a slightly changed or improved version of the medicine, you get 20 years from that date of that new patent. And so this, what we might call tacking of patents, extends the term of exclusivity. Sometimes by over, 20 plus years, they can get that extra time of protection. One thing I'd like to raise, because it's not something that's usually addressed in patent thickets, is that patent thickets also interfere with the efforts to make products that work better for people in low and middle income countries. So some of the incremental modifications, for example, to make a medicine more heat stable, we don't worry that much about heat stability in the United States because almost everyone has a refrigerator, right?
Right.
Well, there's lots of places in the world where people don't have refrigerators. There's a famous example of people in Thailand having to carry, those little ice buckets with them all the time to store the original version of an antiretroviral medicine and spending half a day's wages just on the ice for the ice bucket. And in part, that's because, the product innovator wasn't concerned so much about heat stability. And so that incremental modification is incredibly important, under-recognized, and it crowds out the possibility of developing country researchers and product developers making those kinds of improvements so that the medicine can be more readily utilized in their context.
Is there a sort of venue shopping that goes on in the pharmaceutical industry based on differences in patent systems between one country and another?
Well, the big difference is that the patent holders, the innovators, are most interested in filing for patent protection in countries that might otherwise be able to produce the medicine. Okay. So historically, they have always patented in, Europe, US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and bigger middle income countries that have some more pharmaceutical manufacturing capacity. But I don't know whether you've talked with your listeners before about the Patent Cooperation Treaty, which is a very easy mechanism for a product developer to file with the World Intellectual Property Organization in Geneva. And basically, a single application can then be recognized as having been filed in all the countries that are checked off in that application, all the countries that are members of the Patent Cooperation Treaty. And so the existence of that treaty has made it much easier for drug companies to initiate for patent protection, to apply for patent protection in an even broader scale than just rich countries and what are called farm merging middle income countries that either have pharmaceutical capacity or big markets that would be interested in and slightly richer usually. So historically there were many countries where pharmaceutical companies never bothered to apply because they just didn't think it was worth their effort.
Does that give rise to an opportunity for NGOs and other organizations to go to those countries where there's no patent protection for a needed medication and make it there at low cost and without all the patent concerns?
Well, only if the country can make the medicine. Yeah. If it has to import it and the patent has been filed in the countries that can produce, then it doesn't have a source. Now, we do have some examples of countries that did not allow patent protection on pharmaceutical products who developed strong pharmaceutical industries. Even in the pre-TRIPS era, India did not patent pharmaceutical products pursuant to patent legislation adopted in 1970, and it has developed one of the strongest generic industries in the world. More recently, Bangladesh, which is a least developed country, and which as a least developed country also doesn't have to protect patents on products, provide for them, has also developed a generic industry and has played an important role to supply its own population. And because it can be produced lawfully in Bangladesh, it can be exported to other countries where there's not a patent. So when you think about patents, you have to be concerned both about whether there's a patent in the country of production and export and in the country of importation. And if there's a patent either place, it doesn't work, right? Essentially.
Yeah.
And just one other thing with respect to this, generic companies need markets of certain size, again, depending on the disease, in order for the product to be profitable. And so many times what a generic company is looking for is an aggregated market, not just exporting to one other country, or not just exporting to a few countries where no patent is currently had been applied for, but in broader markets, including middle income countries and upper middle income countries, and on a regional basis. It would make much more sense for a regional producer in Africa to be able to supply all of Africa. It'd make much more sense for a Latin American producer to be able to supply all of Latin America, similarly in Southeast Asia. And so that's where the existence of patchwork patents can really interrupt the attractiveness of a generic market to incentivize entry by multiple generic producers who will compete and therefore sell at more competitive and lower cost.
We've seen, Brooke, the generic market has its own challenges from an efficacy and safety standpoint. We've seen some of the large generic manufacturers in India, for example, run into problems within their own manufacturing processes, where the FDA and other regulatory entities have had to go in there, which raises another big issue that I wanted to ask you about. You were recently quoted in an article in Northeastern wrote about syphilis, and this surprised me to find out that apparently syphilis, the communicable disease, is at its highest rates in 30 years in the United States. 200,000 cases in 2022 compared to 50,000 in presumably 2012. And as the article reported, the only medication that's available that treats syphilis in pregnant women is in shortage. And the amazing thing is that the holder of the patents, presumably, right, is none other than Pfizer, which has, as we know, can produce lots of medicine very, very quickly. Can you explain what's going on? I could make some educated guesses, but as an access to medicine issue, can you explain what's going on behind the scenes here?
Well, I mean, shortages can come from multiple causes, right? And they can occur with respect to generic medicines as well as originator medicines. But basically,
and by originator, you mean patent, the ones that are on patent
like
protection.
Pfizer.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And so, the basic principle is if it's a highly profitable medicine, they'll find a way to make it quickly. So, take COVID vaccines and Paxlovid and Molnupiravir, COVID antivirals. Those companies made it very quickly.
Right.
And if they didn't have sufficient capacity in their own plants, they entered into agreements with entities that are called contract manufacturers. And so they basically commissioned another plant to make the medicine for them and slap their brand on it, right? And you had to follow all the, meet all the quality and safety and efficacy, but it's essentially they will move with alacrity, and passion to chase those profits, right?
Right.
If it's a small markup medicine, or if it's a relatively small market, right? They do not have the same incentive to use scarce manufacturing capacity to make a lower profit medicine. It's kind of economics and commercial profits 101. A different problem has arisen with respect to generic medicines and shortages of generic medicines, which is sometimes the margins are so small. And there's just a report on this and Stat today, I think, where the margins are so small that generic companies leave the field and there's no one left to make it, right? One last complication is that, for example, in the United States, one of the problems might be is whether a competing producer, even for a medicine that's off patent, whether they bother to register their product in the US with the Food and Drug Administration. So the Pfizer medicine may have a generic equivalent produced at good standard of quality, safety, and efficacy someplace in the world, but that company may not have bothered to register it in the US because of the power of Pfizer and the preference of prescribers to prescribe a Pfizer medicine. And so you can have shortages from multiple, if you have single suppliers and then something goes wrong with a plant, like you said before,
Right.
like that's it.
Right.
And so there are problems of, I think one problem certainly is the profit incentive interfering with decisions to supply.
Right.
But we also need to encourage there to be multiple producers of more products and maybe build up the margin on some of the medicines that are quite cheap now, but actually put it a little more on the table so that a producer has an incentive to stay in the business.
Well, that's kind of what I want to get to. I want to put aside the trade secret issues, which, as you know, I focus on and ask because we'll go the rest of the time, and and even Denise will say, "This is enough of this." So I gotta not do that. So here's the different question, but closely related, right? So the issue is control, right? It's control over a particular formula, a particular process, and of course, one proposal has been, well, IP law is the problem. But there are other solutions to this or potential solutions. So I'm curious, one which immediately comes to mind, and we saw it in COVID, was the government stepping in and saying, we'll buy it, right? And we saw that happen with COVID, which gets to the question of demand, right? This is what I want to tie to the ice bucket challenge, right? The ice bucket challenge suddenly created, for those who don't remember, it's about 10 years ago at least now, right? Created this like viral scene where people were dumping ice on themselves to raise money for ALS, for Lou Gehrig's disease. We're not obviously seeing an ice bucket challenge apparently for the syphilis drug, but how much power do consumers have at the end of the day, right, to push pharmaceutical manufacturers to produce drugs that don't have a huge demand at that point, and of course they could also charge astronomical amounts of money for it, which insurance companies might or might not cover. Do consumers have any way to deal with this? And I want to focus on the United States, where there might actually be some buying power.
Yeah, well, we should differentiate between different kinds of treatments, at least to some extent.
Okay.
So a syphilis treatment is short term. A lot of so-called antibiotic treatments, right? You take the medicine for 5 or 7 days, and that's it. Whereas for diabetes, you take a medicine every day for the rest of your life, right? So if you're a drug company, do you want to invest your research and development, and do you want to invest your manufacturing capacity in a high volume, continuous demand product, right?
Right.
Or something that's very short. So there's a global problem with respect to the market for antibiotics. It's going to be a huge, international meeting on this coming fall in the UN system, right?
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah.
Because of the problem of growing antimicrobial resistance to existing medicines. So, let's say that it's not likely that people exposed to syphilis or having syphilis would somehow mobilize themselves, right? It's thought to be a shameful disease, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
And so the consumers are unlikely to do that, right? And they're working against a very strong tide of commercial motivation, focusing either on these daily medicines for chronic diseases that are historically called blockbusters, or increasingly what the industry focuses on, which are things called niche busters, where these orphan diseases that affect small numbers of people, but for which they charge absolutely astronomical prices. The highest now being over $4 million for a particular treatment.
Oh my God.
$4 million for a treatment. So, and these are what are called niche busters, which is because you get extra uh, exclusive rights when you develop a what's called an orphan drug under U.S. law. You get additional periods of exclusivity, and not only with respect to stopping a copy of your medicine, right? But another medicine in that field. If you're the first to make the orphan drug that treats a particular condition, you can freeze out someone with even better therapy from entering the market for a period of time. So this is like, patent squared, right?
Yeah.
It's not just on your invention, it's for a field, even though it's a relatively small field. And of course, they tend to be diseases that have quite disastrous consequences that are relatively small in number. Though, cancer, there's many of the treatments are considered orphan because there's so many different kinds of cancers and they can slice and dice what the patient population is. Anyway, it's a long-winded answer to say that, the industry has figured out where its commercial returns are, and it has simultaneously, therefore, neglected other areas. And
Right.
so
everybody's busy making Ozempic or Ozempic equivalents.
Yeah,
right
now.
right
Right now.
Exactly, because that's projected to be $150 billion a year therapeutic class.
Yeah.
So, because many of us carry a few extra pounds.
Right.
Well, this may be a record for our show, having gone this long without uttering the syllables AI.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I think it is for sure.
But I'm going to utter them now.
Okay, good.
I'm curious, Brooke. It's a huge question and a huge topic, but I'm curious about your take on the role of AI in breakthroughs in medical research and development.
Well, I think it can be very promising. There was just a report out this week indicating, that they have figured out how to use AI to identify 1 million different potential antimicrobial medicines. And basically, the AI was so strong, it called information from so many sources. It basically, from what I understand, called information from every living thing that's known in the world at this point in time. Okay, so it didn't depend on collecting a soil sample and then somehow figuring out how to extract each of the microbes. It basically called all that information down to the protein level, protein and the genetic sequence, so that those microbes or those not microbes, those chemical entities or biological entities could be separately sequenced and manufactured. And so, they narrowed down, say, I don't know, 1 billion, 1 trillion, I forget what the number was, but they selected the promising ones, 1 million out of the haystack, okay? A huge haystack, and the 1 million is still a haystack, but it's different from a 100 billion size haystack, right?
Very different, yeah.
And so, it was really only AI that could, call that kind of information. So in some ways, and there's another application of AI where it figured out how to explain, demonstrate how each protein folds and how it will interact with other proteins and so forth. I'm not a scientist.
No, fair enough. Yeah.
Yeah.
This is you're working at the edge of my ability to explain things.
It's what happens when 3 lawyers start talking about science.
But basically, this allows them to say, oh, that's a key that's going to work on that disease. I mean, the shape of that particular molecule and the way it folds, we know it can attach to the attachment site of a virus and prevent that attachment site from attaching to a cell. And so it's there. I think there are lots of promising examples. Some people are worried about some applications of AI. I'm sure you talked about those on other parts of your show, but I think in this area it's quite promising. But who's going to own the information? Who's going to own the result of those discoveries? Who's going to are there going to be exclusive rights? If someone gets to, there's another example which I think is useful. There's a report that AI can identify every possible way to synthesize a molecule, every way. Okay. Well, then you can file a process application on every one of those and have a total exclusion of the possibility of having a molecule produced by an alternative means by another producer, right?
Right.
Now, it might not be economically feasible or, to file that many patent applications because of patent application and maintenance fees, but theoretically it's possible. But it's exemplary of the bigger problem. Are the fruits of this scientific inquiry and this massive mining of information, which does not originally come from the people who are running the AI, right? They basically got a comb. They've got a search engine that finds a lot of information and puts it through algorithms to get some outcomes. But the information is the global commons. It's all the information that's available in the world. And do we want people to be able to privatize the practical application of that knowledge because they're able to use extremely powerful AI to crystallize the knowledge which is most useful for particular purposes? And I think that's the discussed and under-recognized issue that we are going to have to confront, which is a Pfizer of the future going to have such a powerful AI capacity that it can really steal or seal the cancer field for itself?
Yeah. And it's, of course, I can imagine the pushback here, Brooke. So I'm going to give it to you, which is such is the price of amazing drugs, or such is the price of having this kind of life-saving medicine. In other words, right? Maybe the problem is the IP system, as we've both alluded to. But to be clear, right? The argument in favor of this is say, look, if you want to have this amazing outcome, which required enormous time and effort to put together and so forth, then this is the price for it. The price is we need to be able, going back to your earlier example, even with the $4 million drug, which obviously is shocking, but I could see the argument there too, which is, well, it was expensive to develop. And of course, there are super competitive profits that are made and so forth. So the question I have really is the critique that you're making ultimately a critique of the IP or the incentive system itself? Or do you think that the problem is something else entirely?
Well, we do not.
When we talk about talk about AI, of course, it's the same issue. This is amazing computing power that private entities have developed, and they didn't do it as a charity, and everyone knows it. And so here we are.
Right. And so, I would never want to be understood as suggesting that we don't want R&D, that we would not want to deploy carefully regulated AI for its best purposes. That's not my argument. And that those efforts have to be paid for. They can be paid for in ways that are other than exclusive rights and monopoly pricing power and 20 years of monopoly or 40 years of monopoly once you add evergreening. Because we know that when those exclusive rights exist, the pharmaceutical companies will literally charge as much as they can. So the profit, the pure profit not just sales, but the profit on COVID products, a disease that in it, really only lasted in a really, very strong way for 3+ years, generated over $100 billion in pure profit for the vaccine manufacturers and the antiviral manufacturers and the monoclonal antibody manufacturers. And, developing countries didn't get the vaccines. Almost none of them got Paxlovid. None of them got the monoclonal antibodies. And that's because the prices charged were high, and because of the vaccine nationalism of rich countries that secured 3 and 4 times and 5 times a number of vaccines that they needed for their populations.
Right.
So the question back to you is, can't we come up with a better system that pays for and rewards research and development, but not at a cost of such strong monopoly power that many populations go unserved for a while, or perhaps forever, in a sense, and where we don't have a system that really results in the product of scientific progress being shared with everyone who needs it. Kind of the statement you made at the beginning, right? Everyone in the world, no matter where they are from, no matter what their nationality, gender, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, etc., gender, whatever, right? They will all have access to the medicines they need. Well, our system doesn't produce that.
One glimmer of hope that I see is in this weird patchwork global patent system that we've talked through a bit today, and applying AI to that problem, as well as the problem of R&D and actually developing, wonderful new revolutionary medicines. I would think that you could apply AI to the business side of it too, and find places where the patent exclusivity wouldn't apply, and how to maximize resources to be able to produce there where it hasn't been possible in the past, and really leverage, really narrow opportunities that others have ignored because they're not practical. I could see AI finding ways to make them practical.
Well, AI might help, though we know some things that do work. We know there's what's called tiered pricing, different prices for different countries based on income. Now, unfortunately, that's usually controlled by the drug company, and they can charge, and oftentimes do charge in low and middle income countries, a price that is higher with respect to per capita income, on a per capita income basis, a percentage of per capita income, than in the United States. So poor people in poor countries have to pay disproportionately more of their total income towards a medicine than the people in the richest countries in the world. So tiered pricing, again, when it's controlled and often secretly controlled, that is, there's non-disclosure of what the prices are, can result in gross inequality continuing. But it can be a step in the right direction. It would be a much better step in the right direction if we really had greater transparency on the costs of production, and distributed more equity with respect to income. There's also voluntary licensing, and sometimes compulsory licensing, where alternative producers are allowed to make the medicine and sell it more cheaply, and frequently can do so because they don't have to do the R&D. They don't have the same bloated cost basis as Pfizer does, with all the advertisers and all the lobbyists and executives getting huge amounts of compensation. So we have some things that already work, and I guess then the question is, okay, what would AI add? What granularity? It might be granularity that AI would add. I don't think it's going to come up with the big ideas, because we kind of know what the big ideas are. Let other people make it, sell it closer to the cost of production for people who are poor, at least poor. But maybe as on the whole, why don't we do what's called delinkage, which is pay for research and development and then pay for access afterwards. But what you
Right.
pay for access is really the cost of production and a little bit of profit so the plants can stay open. And you make
And
sure
that-
the researchers get paid, but you don't have this huge bloated mammoth self-protective industry that spends a ton on advertising and a ton on detailing physicians and a ton on lobbying, right? And puts most of the extra money that they earn, it puts into stock buybacks and executive compensation, more than they spend on R&D.
it is amazing to see the first Jardiance commercial main actor is a social media phenomenon now and is doing stuff on Cameo because that is such a catchy tune that yeah, it's amazing. I mean, good, good for her. I mean, and good for the actors, and I guess good for Jardiance. But it is quite something that marketing has been so successful. Let me ask you one last question, Brooke, before we do our speed round. You've written, you and a few co-authors have written that modelers predict, this is a quote, an over 50% chance of another global pandemic as deadly as COVID-19 in the next 25 years. To be clear, you are not one of those modelers. You're citing the models, but you started alluding to it. And so, this is a funny question to ask in a short period of time. But I'm going to ask you a big picture. What does a global response look like ideally? And more importantly, really, my first question is, how prepared do you think we are for the next pandemic from an access to medicine and medicine standpoint?
With the response to COVID was status quo with respect to intellectual property. In fact, it was status quo plus, because the government's invested a lot to support the research and development and clinical trials and building up manufacturing capacity that occurred. And so, the industry was in fact de-risked, but still earned enormous profits.
Mm-hmm.
So and we had limited supplies, artificially high prices,
Mm-hmm.
and grossly inequitable distribution because
and I interrupt you, by de-risk, you basically mean the government bought it, so there was no
well, they subsidized the
right,
research and development.
right,
I mean,
right,
they subsidized the clinical trials.
right,
They
right.
in some cases actually paid to expand manufacturing capacity, and then they guaranteed purchases.
Right. Right.
I mean, it's like
Good deal.
it's a good deal.
Yeah,
It's a very good deal, and
yeah.
especially good deal for monopolists.
Mm.
So, if we don't change that fundamental reality of commercial control and intellectual property fundamentalism, we will be unprepared in the same way, in the sense of being able to deliver equitably to all the people who need, on an appropriate basis.
Mhm.
Now, there will still be incentives to innovate quickly, right? And there'll be a little bit more open science at the beginning. One of the plus things about in the response to COVID is there was a little more open science, a little more sharing of information and research results, a lot more wastage of poorly structured clinical trials, and a lot of potentially good opportunities that were lost along the way because the first movers have such strong commercial advantage and basically crowd out better products that are in the pipeline. But if we change the system, and we basically agreed in advance, we are going to promote open science. There's not going to be a scientist in the world who doesn't know what other scientists know, can't get access to what the other scientists know about the different ways to think about treating, preventing this disease, right? And this is how we're thinking. This is how we're thinking about manufacturing. And this is how we might think about improving the manufacturing. All those things that go into making a good medical, safe, effective, and quality assured medicine. That information should be shared. Trade secrets, the whole thing, right? And it should be shared both to speed up innovation and to make the innovation more efficient, right? Because you could test multiple therapeutics against each other, and then as opposed to each therapeutic against a placebo, which is a stupid way to come up with a quick best medicine for different contexts.
Yeah.
And then you could also say, okay, and we're going to share this information for access too. We're going to expand the number of manufacturers. We're going to allow there to be enough manufacturers to meet demand as quickly as we can, instead of that capacity being limited to a subset of companies with their existing capacity and their favored contract manufacturers. We're going to share so that we would make the vaccines and the medicines much more quickly, and therefore they could be distributed more equitably.
Yeah, to that point of speed, am I right to assume that the quick development process and what we know now about mRNA vaccines that we didn't have before, that would speed up a response to something like this in the future?
Right. Well, there is, and I don't know whether you talked about it on your show before, but there's something called the 100-day project, which is basically to be able to come up with vaccines and hopefully therapeutics. So the same promise is not really yet realized on therapeutics, but really the thought that you may be able to come up with a vaccine from identification of the disease to a product, right, that can be registered and used, get regulatory approval and be used in 100 days, right?
Yeah.
And that depends somewhat on this open science principle, right? And it depends, and you're right, it depends on messenger RNA platform is particularly well suited to quickly tag on a new, let's call it new active ingredient, right?
Yep.
That's identified, that works against the, disease, that actually helps the body produce the ingredient itself internally, which is what messenger RNA does.
Yeah.
You can do that very quickly. It's just like changing the, if you got a multi-use tool, or just put another tool at the end, right?
Because of time, Brooke, we're going to go to our speed round quickly, but it does, going back to something Denise asked earlier, one could be optimistic and hope, or certainly we could see it developing where the cost of production and the cost of research drops significantly, such that at least if we come back to the issues of incentives, right, the dollar amounts subject to regulation could make things more affordable. But ultimately, the intractable challenge, it boils down to, at least to me, it boils down to the fact that we have a system that is set up in a way to create these kinds of perverse incentives. And so the question is, how do we, within that system, operate? We're going to turn to the speed round. As much as Brooke, I desperately want to continue, but in the interest of time, the speed round, we're going to jump right in. And boy, is this a hard right turn from where we were, because now we're going to ask some serious questions and some not so serious. Although I love this question. Denise asked it, I think, for the first time on our last show. And actually, I think we should ask it regularly. I'm going to put it out there. So here it is. Question number one: best restaurant in Boston?
Mida is very good.
There we go.
MIDA.
MIDA.
MIDA. Taking notes.
I'm writing it down. Yep.
I know. Maybe we'll publish a book.
I think so. I think we have something.
All our guest restaurant
recommendations.
Go
to all the expensive restaurants there. So
no, it doesn't have to be expensive. It's just the best one. Yeah.
This one may be a little subjective, but best medicine in history?
I guess we'd have to say penicillin,
Yeah. What about the biggest flop?
What is it? The anti-nausea medicine that ended up creating so many birth defects.
Oh, yes. Right.
Thalidomide.
Thalidomide, yes. Yeah. That's a good one. Good flop medicine. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Vioxx was pretty bad too, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. You mentioned you're about to go to Geneva. What's your favorite country to visit for a week?
For a week? We love going to South Africa. I've gone there about 20 or 25 times.
And I know, and because I do know you travel the world, the country that you've not visited that you'd like to go next, if you can.
I've never been to Japan. I'd be interested to go to Japan at some point.
And I think this is a funny speed round question, because I feel like we could have done an entire episode on it, but generic medications or brand names?
Oh, generic.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's
Wonderful.
yeah, and then which ones? But that now we have another hour.
Yeah.
All right. So Brooke, look, Brook Baker, professor at Northeastern, and retiring professor at Northeastern. Congratulations on your retirement, on a career that has been really within the access to medicine community, I think legendary. I'm pleased to hear that while you're retiring from being a full-time law professor, you're not retiring from access to medicine issues because you are desperately needed. This show is going to air well after this date, but this coming Monday, Northeastern, June 10th, is going to be honoring you and your career. I will be tuning in via Zoom, but alas, by the time this show goes on, it won't be there. Although the interview I did with you at KZSU will air tomorrow, June 8th. Meanwhile, thank you so much for joining us on R&D with D&D with Denise Howell and me, Dave Levine. You can find all of our shows and content from the Hearsay Culture Network by going to hearsayculture.com or the major platforms for podcast listening. Do check out what we're up to and consider subscribing because there's a lot more to offer. But meanwhile, we'll say thank you, Brooke, for joining us today. Thank you for educating our listeners. Thank you for listening to the Hearsay Culture Network, and have a great day.
Thank you so much.